Buonasera. Io non sono Stefano Albertini. I'm not Stefano Albertini, as you can see. I'm Laura Caparrotti, and I'm very happy to welcome you tonight for the screening of the legend of Carlo Tresca, which is I know the name because he wrote some very beautiful plays, and during the documentary that I did years ago, and that you know very well, I read some of the plays, and I actually would love to produce one because they're fantastic. So, now this is not about me, this is not about theater, it's about Carlo Tresca, and it's about his figure, and I want to ask Steve Cerulli here to come and give you really the proper welcome for tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. So this is co-sponsored with the Calandra Institute. Unfortunately, the Dean, Anthony Tambori, could not be here, but he passed on a message for me to read with everyone. So I'm going to read this briefly. And then I was just also asked to give like a quick bio of Carlo Tresca before starting the movie. So I'll do that hopefully within 3 or 4 minutes. So from the Dean. Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry not to be with you this evening, but in my position as the Dean of the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute, I simply must be elsewhere. I did not have a choice. Were it not for this institutional commitment of mine in Albany, I would have been delighted to be here. This is a significant event for its triadic nature. Briefly, we have a group of cultural brokers from Italy, Angelo, Francesco, Maurizio, and others, who are celebrating an Italian immigrant hero that is Carlo Tresca. That in itself is special. That is then done in collaboration with both an Italian and Italian-American institution, makes it all more unique. The tripartite characteristic that many of us might think is obvious and regular is not. This is one of the seemingly regular counters we wish it to be. It is still not in 2023. By that he means a collaboration between Italian-American and Italian institutes. The Casa Italiana, under the direction of Dr. Stefano Albertini, is productively distinctive in so many ways. It's a collaboration with Italian-American institutions is one of them. So con tanto di cappello to Stefano and his team for keeping the doors wide open to the hyphenated Italian, be it tonight, as well as all other events we have and shall continue to co-organize. In closing, I also wish to thank Angelo and his team for including us in this special event. A special thanks also goes to Julian and his team of dedicated staff members who, as well, always make us feel at home. I know it's not necessary, but I wish you all a fruitful evening. I look forward to seeing the videotape, as Warner Wolf might say on his occasion. Break a leg, Anthony Julian Tambori. I also have a couple copies of Carlo Tresca's autobiography, whatever I could fit in my backpack. So if you're interested, come to me after the screening and Q&A, and I'll hand them out. I also have a couple of handouts from a memorial service we did for his 80th assassination, celebrating or memorializing him on the 80th anniversary of his assassination. So how do I want to begin talking about Carlo Tresca? I think it's best to start with an antidote. During the Masabi Iron Range strike, Carlo Tresca was organizing with the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World. A group of strike breakers were following Tresca and his colleagues out of the Iron Range and into town. Tresca knew who they were after. They were after him. So what did he do? He stepped out from the back of the truck and told the people, his compatriots driving the truck, go on, they're here for me. And someone shouted out, coraggio, courage. And I think in this small little story, we have somewhat of an idea of who Carlo Tresca was. Carlo Tresca was born in Sulmona, Italy, in the Abruzzo region, to a minor noble family, which means they're called dons. They own small amounts of land. However, as the 1880s and 1890s developed, the family actually came into hard financial times. Tresca actually went into the priesthood, but he failed out of it because he was famously atheist and anti-clerical. And in the early 1900s, facing a libel charge, one of many charges he will face throughout his life. I think he was arrested 22 or 23 times. He ran away from Italy, ended up in New York. He attached himself to a group, a subculture, they're called the sodversivi, the subversives, who were part of the Italian-American kind of cultural fabric going really into the 1950s, but petering out during the interwar years. And what he did with the Silver Sea was basically organize Italian Americans in the labor movement, right, to fight for their rights as workers. As the 19 teens go on, he actually ends up becoming one of the major organizers of the industrial workers of the world, leading the second wave of the Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts, and then going on to organize one of the largest strikes in American history, the Paterson Silk Strike in New Jersey, among many others. As the 1920s unfold, his labor agitation evolves into anti-fascism. And I'm going to tap a little bit into what Anthony was mentioning here. This anti-fascism included, beyond literally fighting fascism, also kind of a battle over the contestation of Italianità, which is like the Italianness, right? Where you have people like Tresca going to the Garibaldi Monument, the Columbus Monument in Columbus Circle, and fighting over these symbols of Italianità and not surrendering them to the reactionaries within the Italian American community. Naturally, he would make many enemies, right? Even within the left, such as the Stalinist left, also very famously anti-mafia, and as I mentioned already, anti-fascism. He tragically was killed not too far from here with his 6th and 14th. It's assumed that it may have been a mafioso named Carmine Galante, but still kind of contested over who it is. But I want to end with a small story as well. At his funeral, there was an Irish police officer weeping. And when asked why, and he was basically saying, like, I can't believe this great man, right? And mind you, the police were his literally enemy. They arrested him over 20 times. You couldn't believe that this great man was assassinated. And I think with that beginning and the end, we have somewhat of an ideal of who this Italian, and Italian-American figure was. And I'm going to pass it over to Claudio Gatti.
Thank you. Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Claudio Gatti. I'm a Rome-born, New York-based investigative journalist and writer, and I'll be moderating the panel that will follow the documentary. But before we do that, I'd like to just say, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Luciana Capretti for organizing this. I don't know where you are, but thank you, Luciana. And then I'd like to say a few words about the author of the documentary, Angelo Figorilli, who just landed. Where are you? Oh, there you are, sorry. Landed from Italy just a couple of hours ago. Angelo worked for many years as a journalist for Rai, the Italian television. He was in the foreign desk, but also he was a correspondent, and he covered wars, Afghanistan and Iran, and then he covered the banlieue of France, and then he came here, covered the Obama presidency and the presidency of Obama's successor, who I'm not going to name because I don't work for CNN. Back in Rome, he became the head of the foreign desk at TG2, which is one of the evening of the news programs in Italy, and then sort of he left Rai, or maybe Rai left you, I don't know which one, but he is now, being author of this documentary, which you will see now. Thank you, everybody. Dorothy, born and raised in New York City. She was a feature editor for Redbook magazine before becoming freelance writer and journalist. She worked for the New York Times Magazine. She wrote for the New York Times Book Review. She published a memoir, Life Stories, Hannah's Daughters. And then the book that we all know, All the Right Enemies, The Life and Murder of Carlo Tresca. Thank you for coming. Alexander Stille. Stille is a journalist and author, was written extensively on Italian subjects, from Italian Jews under fascism in the book Benevolence and Betrayal, to the Sicilian Mafia, Excellent Cadavers, to Silvio Berlusconi, which is part of the Italian Mafia too, The Sack of Rome, He's about to publish his sixth book on a decidedly un-Italian subject, The Sullivanians, Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wildlife of an American Commune. The story of a psychoanalytic institute in New York that evolved into urban commune and evolved into cult, which will be coming out next month. Congratulations. And Stephen Cerulli is the Bennett Distinguished Fellow of Fordham University, where he's a PhD candidate in modern history. He holds 2 appointments at the City University of New York as a lecturer in social science and Hostos Community College. And is also a researcher as the John D. Calandra Italian America Institute at Queens College. He most recently edited and wrote a critical introduction for the second edition of Giovanni Schiavo's The Italians in America Before the Revolution. All right. I'll start with Angelo. I already introduced you, but a question about the documentary. Can you tell us what led you to write this and produce it, and what were the main challenges that you faced?
Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for coming. I'm very happy to be here tonight with you, but I have to apologize because my English is not good enough to allow me to have the conversation that Carlo Tresca deserved. So forgive me. Anyway, I will try to say something. First of all, I want to thank Stefano, Albertini, all the people, Luciana, and all the people della Casa Italiana who gave us this opportunity. It's an honor for me and for Francesco Paolucci to bring our documentary on Carlo Tresca in New York 80 years after his death. It means closing a circle of gratitude to a man too long forgotten. Our work, as you have seen, is not a historical documentary. There are no new revelations, no new documents about the life and the death of Carlo Tresca. It's rather a sentimental portrait of this man. Why this choice? It's simple. The first reason is that I too was born in Sulmona, the town of Carlo Tresca. And for many years, I saw these men and women of my town, very few, but very stubborn, keeping his memory alive, against everything, against everyone, in a general silence. So with Francesco, we decided to tell their story. We asked them, tell us not what you know about Carlo Tresca, but what you feel. Why you love him so much. So we did the interviews. They were very good, but it became clear to me that they were not enough. There were local people who talking about their hero. Maybe they overestimated him. So we didn't know how to move forward. That's when we met Maurizio Maggiani, an Italian writer who had written beautiful page about Carlo Tresca in his last book, L'Eterna Gioventù. So we asked him for an interview, and the result was that he spoke for more than an hour with great passion about Carlo Tresca. So we putting the interviews together. We had a sentimental portrait of Tresca as a Don Quixote from the last century. But now we had another problem, as you have seen. It was a story from the last century. So there were no images, just a few black and white photos and generic video files. But we didn't want to make a black and white documentary. We want color on Carlo Tresca. So we decided to ask Eric, a young Mexican digital graphic designer, to tell the story through his images and imagination. And I think it worked. I hope so. I hope so. So that's it. And one last thing, I'm very happy that tonight, to remember Tresca, we have Steve and Alex on this stage. But let me say a special thank you from the bottom of my heart to Dorothy Gallagher. And now the best thing I can do is to give them the floor. Thank you.
I'll start with you if you don't mind, but if you have anything to say. At the end, we all heard Maggiani, the writer, saying that the ultimate order to kill Tresca came from Mussolini. Do you agree with that?
No. Is this on?
No.
No.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, unfortunately not. It would be a nice ending. He would have liked that. But it was a little more mundane than that. He was killed actually by a up and coming gangster named Carmine Galante, who is well known in New York, or was well known as a gangster. And probably on the orders of Frank Garofalo, who was a bodyguard to Generoso Pope. And
That's the publisher of Italian
publisher
newspaper,
of Il
Gene
Popolo,
Pope.
yes, who was a fascist, but fascism really didn't enter into Tresca's murder at all, I'm afraid. The reasons were personal. Tresca had insulted the girlfriend of Garofalo. She came to see him. She sat on his lap. Garofalo didn't like that. He was humiliated, and so Carmine Galante was given the order to kill Tresca.
I see. Were you going to say something else, or
No, what I wanted to say was it's true that my biography of Tresca was the first in English, but there was another full-length biography by Nunzio Perniconi, and
Right.
I don't know if people are aware of that.
I've actually a quick question for all the panelists, and if you don't mind, I'd like to have a one-word answer. In the documentary, they talk about Tresca being an internationalist, an Italian union leader, and a Don Quixote. Which one do you think he was the most, in your opinion? All three of you. Start, Dorothy.
One of my choices?
Internationalist, Italian labor leader, or Don Quixote?
I think he was an Italian labor leader.
Steve? Alex?
I don't know about Italian labor leader. He was an American labor leader. He was in the middle of a very short time. Sorry, is this working?
No.
Okay, I'll try that. I'd say it's more accurate to say he's an American labor leader. He left Italy when he was very young. He came here. But also, one of the things that's so interesting about his career, one tends to forget all the people in these massive strikes were almost all foreign-born immigrants themselves, many of them Italian. So the distinction between international, national, Italian, American breaks down when you look at his career. I think that's an important point.
All right. In terms of Dorothy, are there aspects of his life, his figure, his political activity that you'd like to stress above the other? Is unionism and his trade union activity, or is there anything else?
Well, that was his life. not trade. Well, he was associated for a time with the IWW, but that came to an end in 1915, 16 after the Misabi Iron Range strike. And then he was an independent. He was an independent labor leader, independent voice for Italian American immigrants, um, the the voice for work for Italian immigrant workers, I think. And his newspapers were very effective. I myself, I'm sorry to admit, I do not speak or read Italian, so a lot of his newspapers were unavailable to me. But Alexander helped me with translation, and I thank him for that now, if I didn't before.
Let's see if this
Yes.
is this working now. Okay. One thing that I think is worth mentioning, and that came at I was preparing to do the presentation today, provided me the opportunity to reread Dorothy's excellent biography, which I hadn't read since the time it came out. So that was a nice experience, and it kind of re-immersed me into that world. There were many aspects that I'd kind of forgotten about, that I was happy to kind of re-encounter. And something that seemed very important to me was that Tresca, the incredible number of interesting, important historical figures that Tresca crossed paths with. Um, Something that the documentary didn't mention is that as he left the Abruzzo, he actually stopped in Switzerland where he met Mussolini, who was then a socialist firebrand who was gaining fame because he dared God to strike him dead, sitting there with his stopwatch. And Tresco thought this was kind of juvenile and kind of juvenile theatrics, and so they had a kind of exchange there. And then he came to the States. Um, but the people that Tresca, on the one hand, he was deeply immersed in this world of radical American politics. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman and Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who became his lover. But also, he won over and impressed enormously all sorts of American intellectuals and political figures, um, people like Max Eastman, the novelist James Farrell, the socialist leader Norman Thomas. The day he was assassinated, he had lunch with John Dos Passos, the novelist. So it gives you this idea of somebody who moved very comfortably between different levels of society, and that part of his enormous value was in being able to translate the demands and feelings of working class people, many of whom didn't speak English, to the political establishment, to help them get lawyers when they were on trial, give them a voice when they had none. The the event that the film alludes to, this big event in Madison Square Garden at the time of the Patterson strike, was John Reed's idea, the author then of, you know, In Days That Shook the World, and was a huge event. The idea of giving workers a platform in, the main sports arena of the country's largest city was a kind of very novel, interesting piece of political theater that he was central to. So that ability to move between these different um, levels of life was really, I think, unique in that way. I had forgotten until rereading Dorothy's book that Max Eastman had done a long profile in the New Yorker of him, which I then looked up and printed out. And if time permits, I'll read the first paragraph or two of it because it's quite funny and interesting and gives you that feeling of him, of being, and I think the film does a nice job of conveying this part. He was a larger than life person who loved life and loved people and conveyed that. I mean, I know the first time I heard of Carlo Tresca was through my father, who um, came here in late 41 and then was drafted into the army. So he was in New York a short time, but he heard Tresca in one of these famous speeches of his in Union Square. And although I think he was somewhat far from Tresca politically, he was enormously impressed by Tresca's charisma, by his oratory, by his just the kind of élan vital that he transmitted. And he told me a funny story, which I believe is true, unless Dorothy contradicts me. Um, but the story was that as Tresca was being led off to prison, and it's revealing why he was sent to prison. He was sent to prison because his magazine, Il Martello, had published an advertisement of a book by Margaret Sanger, the great sort of promoter of birth control. That was considered to be obscene, and he was then tried for that, which was absurd. It was simply a means of getting him, getting him out of the way. But as he was being sent off to prison, he was on a train with an armed guard, and he was handcuffed. And he managed to convince the guard to let them get off in Washington so he could go say hello to Fiorello LaGuardia, whom he knew. LaGuardia at the time was in the House of Representatives before he became the mayor of New York. And my father's point was that Tresca was so charming that even this guard who was, supposed to lead him to prison was completely seduced by him and allowed him to do what clearly was not part of the Marshal Service or the FBI's program, which is to let him get off the train and go. And then here he is, this man in handcuffs, going into this congressional office and has to explain to LaGuardia why he's handcuffed. So did you ever?
No.
Okay. Well, anyway, we'll assume as the Italian expression goes, "Sono non è vero, è ben trovato." But I have reason to believe it was true because my father told it to me. And I have no reason to. I can't figure why he would have invented it.
Stephen, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, is it okay if I stress why I chose internationalist?
Yes.
And just to add another funny DC story to Alexandra's point, Tresca was pardoned by Calvin Coolidge, and he he went out of his way to go to the White House and anonymously shake his hand to them for the pardon. The reason I chose international is because as an anarchist, Tresca didn't see borders the way most people do. And he viewed his job as liberating the working class, regardless of their ethnicity or nationality. And we can see this in the pages of Il Martello and the types of things that he rallied around. For instance, in the 19 teens, there was a war in Mexico, and Tresca came out on the side of the revolutionaries. Throughout the fascist era, Tresca would send his journal into Italy, sneaking it through the Italian-Swiss border. And then one of the most important events in the 20th century left-wing history, the Spanish Civil War, Tresca rallied support for it in New York City. So I just wanted to explain why I chose that as my choice.
All right. I have again a question for everybody, starting with Dorothy. At the end of the meeting, Maggiani says that this is not simply the story of an anarchist or an anarchist story. It's a story of the power of ideals. Do you see this as some sort of a relic of the past? Can you think of anybody nowadays in the world that would be representing the same ideals as well as Tresca did?
Well, I can't. No, I don't see any modern Tresca. And it's a different world. Tresca lived in the industrial world. We live in the digital world. No, the answer is no.
Do you?
The IWW still exists. Like they're still agitating, they're still organizing. A couple of years ago, they actually organized the largest prison strike in U.S. history. I think 2019, and they're like everywhere. A good friend of mine, he's also wobbly. He's actually doing the writer's strike right now. He's organizing it. He was actually in my neighborhood of Ridgewood, Queens, also Galante's neighborhood at one time, agitating So these people are still out there. They still exist. You just, most mainstream coverage of it, you just will never see. You have to look on radical left websites and blogs to see. But there's a lot of agitating going on, right? Starbucks union workers, Amazon warehouse workers, and a lot of that's being done by IWW members in 2023.
All right. Do you want to say something about this, or?
Well, I would just say that, I mean, as Dorothy said, it was a different moment. And something that is, I think, very valuable about Tresca's story is reminding us of how really brutal early industrialization, late 19th, early 20th century life was. I was looking up some things in preparation for today that in 1892, when they began keeping statistics, 11,000 railroad workers were killed in 1 year. I mean, think of every time they had to couple trains, workers risked being caught between the cars and mutilated. Um, in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, one of the first places where they kept records, out of 250,000 wage earners, 526 were killed in industrial accidents in 1 year. About 2,000 per year were hospitalized, and that would be 1 in 475 killed each year. You look at in the in one of the strikes that Dorothy writes about, a mine strike out in, I think, Colorado, in a mine owned by John D. Rockefeller. The miners, I'm now quoting from Dorothy's book, the miners evicted from their company-owned houses had set up a tent colony on April 20th, 1914. The state militia set fire to the encampment. Women and children died in their sleep, and the death toll rose to 47 in the next few days. Among the miners killed was a friend of Tresca's, Carlo Costa. His body contained 20 bullets when it was found, and his wife and 3 kids, 3 sons, died in their tent. On May 1st, Tresca spoke at a demonstration in Union Square. Name the murderer, Rockefeller. So this, on the one hand, seems like something out of another century, and it literally is something out of another century. But this is also a period in which the rights of working people have been rather steadily eroded, in which many of the kind of, I would say, sort of neoliberal ideas that dominated the Supreme Court in the early 20th century, which deprived workers of rights to actually sue when they were killed, injured, mutilated, their family members killed in these kind of accidents. We see a very similar judicial philosophy governing a lot of decisions of the Supreme Court. It doesn't have maybe quite as dramatic an effect as 1,000 people, railroad workers being killed a year, but you read about the conditions at Amazon fulfillment sites, and it's sort of a 21st century equivalent of that in some ways. So I think remembering this history, which is not quite so remote as it might be, is, I think, a salutary thing.
Yeah, well, the structure of employment hasn't changed, and that's the same. I mean, no,
Yeah, here, I'll take this one.
what were we talking
You were
about?
saying the structure of work had not changed
Yes, the
fundamentally.
structure of work hadn't changed. The capitalism prevails, and workers are subject to those conditions that capitalists choose to grant. Uh, they are the unions. The union movement was very strong in the early part of the century until the first half of the century. The union movement was growing. Workers had more rights, and now we see it diminishing and workers struggling to form unions, which is like the beginning of the 20th century instead of and not what we like to think of as progress.
Actually, I have a question that sent to me by my friend and fellow journalist Andrea Fiano, who cannot be here, and it relates to what you just said. So what he's asking is, was he a product of his time, and therefore, do you think a leader like him can rise and thrive in today's society, or? And he's talking not just political, but in terms of his stature, his activism. Do you
Was he a
think?
product of his time? Yes, of course. There was a very strong socialist movement in Italy. He came out of that. He came out of an anarchist movement in Europe as well. Those movements don't exist anymore.
But you don't think they can?
I don't.
There are hairs beside the wobblies.
I mean, for all their problems, the DSA has grown tremendously since 2015, 2016, and I'm personally critical, but it is socialist organizing happening. And as I mentioned, unions are popping up everywhere. My graduate program, we just founded one last year amongst many other colleges. It's just that the configuration of our economics is a little bit different. We're no longer in an industrial economy, right? We're a service economy. And now service workers of all stripes are beginning to form unions.
But you're talking about leaderless movements. What about the possibility of having somebody like Tresca?
I'm not too sure how Tresca would feel about being labeled as a great leader. It's kind of very anarchic. So to answer your question, I mean, do we need leaders? The question with a question.
I'll stay with you. Actually, you as an Italian American probably are the best one for this question. In the 50th anniversary of the execution of Sacco e Vanzetti, and Tresca worked very hard, campaigning, getting funds to support, the defense of Sacco e Vanzetti. So on the 50th anniversary, then Massachusetts Governor Dukakis said that at the end they were convicted and executed primarily because they were Italians and anarchists. And in fact, in those years, especially the beginning of the last century, the famous Italians were called Tresca, Sacco e Vanzetti, Bresci. Now, the famous Italian Americans now are called Christopher Rufo, De Santis, Rudy Giuliani. So what happened to the Italian Americans?
I mean, that's a very tough question to answer because it would require like 2 hours. However, that said, I mean, some of the most, I mean, again, I'm not a fan of electoral politics, but there are progressive Italian Americans. For example, Rosa DeLauro, representing New Haven, one of the most prominent Italian communities in the entire country. Also, speaking of IWW in the 1990s, there's a very famous Italian American named Judy Bari. As I mentioned previously, my friend who's a wobbly and is organizing the Writers Guild strike in New York is also wobbly and Italian American. So they're around. What happened, to answer your question with Rufo, Giuliani, DeSantis, it's called assimilation. And people bought into the kind of Anglo-hegemonic, normative, pro-capitalist, pro-U.S. empire position like many other immigrant groups, Irish, Jewish, etc. It's a very luring, and this is too long to talk about this now, but it's a very luring thing.
Well, there was also a very conservative segment of Italian Americans
Then,
and who were fascists and who were only dissuaded when war broke out.
Even then, we're questioning about.
And even then, yes.
Just a question. Tresca defining himself like a soldier of an ideal. Do you think that this is a story of the past, or can say something today to us? A life of a man that defining himself a soldier of an ideal. We need
Ideal.
We need men like him or not. Oh,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Would be
But-
nice.
So
I think you have to not look for someone that looks exactly like Carlo Tresca, but think of all the people that are fighting against climate change, people who are fighting against landmines in Africa, people who are looking to put war criminals on trial. There are lots of idealistic extraordinary people doing amazing things. It's just that the world doesn't look exactly the way it did in 1913. And so the battle lines are different, the battles are different, and the people are different.
I mean, we desperate need a hero, but I think that our society have to look outside the Occidente to find
The West.
the West to find the hero. Why?
I don't agree.
Yeah.
I don't agree at all. I think that's absurd.
No, okay.
Why should you look outside? I'm happy if there are wonderful leaders in other parts of the world, but to give up on producing something good in our own society seems to me a tragic mistake. You know, I hope there are wonderful leaders in India who are resisting against the xenophobia of Narendra Modi. There are courageous people in Turkey who are resisting against Erdogan, but there are also courageous people in Italy, in France, in any number of countries that are doing their own things. I don't quite understand why you're dividing the world this way. It seems big mistake.
And Dorothy, actually, I have a question. Tresca, in those years, one line of Italian anarchists was quite popular, or certainly well known, were the Galleanisti. And there was this group of anarchists who believe in the power of the violent act. In fact, they were, Bresci killed the King Umberto I, the Empress Elizabeth Austria. I don't know. I don't want to tell you what happens in the Netflix series, but she was killed by an Italian anarchist too. And what did Tresca think of Galleani and his? I mean, there was the famous 1920 Wall Street bombing. I mean, over 30 people were killed.
There was a quarrel between the Gallianisti and Tresca, and they were really enemies. But I want to say also that in regard to Sacco and Vanzetti, there was a time shortly after the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti when Tresca began to tell people that he thought Sacco was guilty, and other anarchists and Italian Americans would have agreed that Sacco was a member of a anarchist group that believed in violence. And as you know, in 1919, there was the Wall Street bombings, the bombing of the Attorney General's house, and these were bombs set by anarchists and Gallianisti or other groups. But I did want to say that about Sacco. It's possible that he was indeed involved in the murder.
Steve.
I can add a little bit of historical context to that. So there's this anarchist ideal called propaganda of the deed, and it emerges out of Italian anarchism, specifically Enrico Malatesta, who makes this argument that basically by committing an act, an act of violence against an authority figure, you will elicit a response within the working classes to spontaneously uprise and overthrow the old order. Tresca, however, was an anarcho-syndicalist, right? So there's different tactics, right? The end goal is basically a classless, stateless society. And what an anarcho-syndicalist argued for is basically organizing through labor unions and having labor unions basically have a giant strike, and after the giant strike, then basically replace the existing power structures, where the insurrectionary anarchists is instead argued for directly challenging power. And Nunzio Pernicone has a really excellent essay about Tresca versus the Gallianisti.
Alex, do you want to add anything on this front, or
No, I think Steve covered it. I actually read the Pernicone piece in preparation for today, and he goes through the complicated arguments. To repeat what Dorothy said, it's true that Tresca told several people that he thought that Sacco was guilty and Vanzetti was innocent, but as Pernicone says, it's not clear that he had any direct knowledge of that, and it may have just been his supposition based on who knows what, his impression of the two people, but it's not the kind of historical truth that you would go to the bank on. So I think it remains an unsettled question as to what actually happened.
also, I believe, Max Eastman was one of the people who
He told
was
Max Eastman,
right.
but he also
Supposedly,
told,
according to Eastman.
But he told Norman Thomas the same thing, and therefore it's credible. Eastman's claim is credible since he told two or three people the same thing. But again, it's not as if he was there, and we don't know what he was basing that conclusion on.
And he was not that close to the Gallianisti, so he...
Right, they might not have told him. He may have simply said, this guy is open and this guy is behaving suspiciously, and therefore I think X. Right.
There was a Sacco and Vanzetti defense committee that Carlo Tresca was a part of. And apparently the first or second lawyer because there's two trials, because there's two crimes that were committed, and it was either the first or the second lawyer apparently is the person who told Tresca that Sacco was guilty and Vanzetti was innocent.
On the other hand, I believe Pernicone said that in one time there was a meeting and Sacco was specifically asked, did you do this? And he specifically say on my children or something, right? I'm innocent. So anyway, just to add some more provocative question. Many people in Europe, certainly in Italy, on the left, especially the radical left, today are totally against sending weapons to the Ukraine. What do you think the most Trescan thing to do would be now?
No, I think it's a fair question, because it depends which radical left are you looking at. I mean, the radical left that's supporting Putin's invasion or what we're at one
Nobody
time,
really does that, not openly.
they're Stalinist, and they're arguing that basically Russia is a bulwark to U.S. imperialism, and it's basically an unfortunate position taken by many contemporary Marxist-Leninists. I would argue that Tresca would probably support sending weapons to Ukraine, but at the same time probably have some mean things to say about the Ukrainian government and its neoliberal policies, but would argue for defending Ukrainian people having the right to defend themselves, which is the position that most contemporary anarchists take.
Do you agree, Dorothy?
I don't disagree.
And Alex?
I don't disagree. No, I think his anti-Stalinism. I think his anti-Stalinism would have. I mean, after all, he was supporting the Allied effort to defeat fascism.
Yeah.
So I think that would have put him in a pro-Ukraine camp. Not to mention that I think he would have admired Zelensky for his courage, because he was very courageous himself. And he just generally favored the little guy over the big guy, and therefore Ukraine over Russia. But it's just a guess.
Yes, Luciana rightly so suggested that I will ask if anybody has a question.
Sure, if you want me to. Just find the first page.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. So it begins this way. It's a long paragraph, so bear with me.
When was it published?
It was published in 1934. Carlo Tresca is the despair of all those young men whose idea of success and glory is to get arrested and sent to jail in the cause of the working class. Tresca holds the international all-time record in this field. He has been arrested 36 times. He has been tried by jury 7 times. The crimes charged against him run all the way from shouting "Viva Socialismo" in a cop's face to first-degree murder, taking in on the way blasphemy, slander, libel, disturbing the peace, sedition, disorderly conduct, criminal obscenity, conspiracy, unlawful assemblage, and incitement to riot. He has had his throat cut by a hired assassin, been bombed, been kidnapped by fascisti, been shot at 4 times, once by an Ohio sheriff from a distance of 8 feet, been marked for death by the agents of Mussolini, and snatched from death's jaws by the magic power of the Black Hand. He was arrested 7 times during the Great Patterson Silk Strike, held in $30,000 bail, and tried by jury 3 times. He has cost the state as much money in legal prosecution as the most desperate criminal, and he is, I believe, since Eugene Debs died, the most universally esteemed and respected man in the revolutionary movement. Indeed, he is the only man whom all 117 varieties, divisions, denominations, sects, sections, and subsections of the revolutionary movement respect and esteem. That's the first paragraph, but I recommend you're reading the whole thing. It also, just to give you a little description, in the next paragraph says, Tresca has the gait and bearing of a mildly liberal gentleman of the old school, genial to the point of weakness, but strong in the faith of that God's in his heaven and all rights of the world. He has large, pale blue eyes made larger by round, rimless lenses, whiskers like the family doctor's, and not unlike a billy goat's, rosy cheeks with fine, kindly dimples in them, the sensitive yet sensuous lips of a poet, and a warm smile for anybody who is not at the moment shooting at him. So that gives you a little bit of the portrait.
Are there any other questions before we go? Okay.
Thank you. So I'm just curious about the relationship between Tresca and Fiorello LaGuardia. Do we know anything else about it? And also, if I may, I want to make a comment, since you were mentioning, fighters of today, that, the most famous anarchist of our days in Italy is also from Abruzzo, and it's his name is Alfredo Cospito, and is now in prison. So I just wanted to mention it, since it's another Abruzzese.
I don't know any more about the relationship with LaGuardia other than the little anecdote I told you, I'm afraid.
Dorothy, have anything?
No.
Oh, okay. I have it.
She controls the mic.
Well, no, I have a question. Yeah, I have a question. Hi, my name is Fraser Ottanelli. I co-authored Nunzio's last book, Nunzio Pernicone's last book. And Nunzio and I disagreed on a lot of things. We were very good friends. We worked well together. I did not like Tresca. And so that made for some very, very interesting conversations. But one other thing I would like to, I wouldn't say I didn't like him. I just had a more complicated relationship with him. One of the things I would like to mention is the fact that, in fact, and to comment on, is how much Tresca, and Tresca would have not liked this, how much he has kind of become a respectable radical in the context of post-World War II Cold War ideology. I'm thinking about, I'm sure some of you already know this, what happened this week. There was a plaque in New Hampshire that was put in front of the house where Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was born. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, we saw many of her images in the film. She was, a firebrand, Tresca's long-term lover. He was the love of her life. But she also had an extraordinary political life, which in many ways paralleled his. She was a woman activist. She started very young. She was active in all the great strikes that they were active together. In the end, she's the one who turned the Sacco and Vanzetti case into a specifically Italian case, into a really reached over, branched out to an Anglo-speaking audience. Yet she committed one major sin. Well, so did he. He slept with her sister and got her pregnant, and Lou Martin was a product of that. But that's a different issue. But she, in terms of our collective memory, she committed one sin, and that is that she became a communist. So after 1936, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's contributions and life, which in many ways parallel or exceeded that of Carlo Tresca, has been written out. And the plaque that was placed in front of her house last week was removed. Carlo Tresca instead, and I really like the title of your book, All the Right Enemies, had all the right enemies. He's no longer a political labor firebrand in the 20s and 30s. He's questioning capitalism, but he's not organizing to overthrow capitalism. So my question is, do you have any questions, or do you have any thoughts about the way in which the memory of Carlo Tresca, the firebrand anarchist, has become more acceptable, more something that we can honor and discuss more openly in the context of this kind of Cold War redefinition of who the right enemies are and who they are not?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. I can't really say that I understand it. Maybe Alexander would like to take it.
What I would take is that, one can hardly say that there are statues going up everywhere to Carlo Tresca, and that he's. What?
We tried lobbying the city.
Yeah.
The corner, they wouldn't do it.
Right. So it's not as if he's been lionized and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn forgotten. I would say they've both been forgotten, with the exception that Dorothy wrote a book about Tresca. You're absolutely right that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is a fascinating historical figure who deserves her own.
She has had a biography, several, I think.
So, I think it's more a question of, yes, it's true that because she became a communist, she probably has fewer admirers today. Tresca, in my opinion, made the right call when he was looking at the USSR under Stalin, and she, for whatever reason, made a different call, but that's life. So you can't really blame people for, making judgments based on that, but she was certainly an incredibly interesting, important figure in her own right.
There, one last, I guess.
A question for Ms. Gallagher. What led you to write a biography of Carlo Tresca?
I can hardly remember. It was so long ago. When I heard his name and I heard something of his story, I thought that if I found out about him, if I wrote about him, he would be a wonderful guide to American radical history. I never really thought of him as an Italian, except that I couldn't read what he wrote. But I was right. He was a wonderful guide. He taught me the history of the labor movement. He taught me the history of the communist movement. He taught me the history of the anarchist movement, and in the years of the first half of the 20th century. He taught me better than I was ever taught in any school. So, and he was a hero. So that was my impulse.
One last question, the lady.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so very much for this fascinating conversation, this marvelous presentation. I must start with a comment which will lead to a question. I graduated from NYU with a summa cum laude with a double major in Romance languages in 1999. I still always carry my alumni card with me. Here's my proud purple card. And here is, I guess, well, here I would agree with you and contradict Dorothy a bit. In 2010, I became a member of Local 1 of IATSE, International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, which was founded on April 26, 1886. I battled incredibly hard to join that union. I was the first immigrant woman to join the union, at least Local 1. I am incredibly passionate about unions and,
Is there a question?
well, what do you folks, I mean, you spoke about unions. What the older, okay, I'll,
Ask the question.
what do you have to say about my generation's view of unions and battling for them?
Let's just move on.
We're very interested.